Hello everybody, my name is Jack Bullen. I am the director of Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair. As I expect you all know, we've been running for 5 years now, and we've got Paul Coldwell with us today. I believe if anyone has any questions, they'll forward them on, and we can try and deal with those later. But Paul and I are going to be discussing his work within the fair, and some sort of highlights that he has. So, Paul, you're an internationally renowned artist and an academic. You are a professor at UAL, and you also write quite a lot for Print Quarterly, I believe, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, Lizzie, my wife, the other director of Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair, met you in 2016, I think it was, whilst you were doing a project at the Freuds Museum, and I wanted to sort of we're going to talk about the role of printmaking within your work, and I think this is a really exhibition, this one and the one you did at the John Soanes Museum. I think it'd be really good to talk about that, and I've got some images that maybe might help us sort of give a better understanding as you talk through it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jack. And first of all, kind of congratulations to you and Lizzie on the success of the fair. I mean, in a relatively short space of time, it's established itself as, you know, an event on the calendar. And I think the way you've responded to the present conditions has been amazing. You know, I'm a bit astounded by the kind of creative solutions that the pandemic has thrown up. Thank you for your very kind introduction. I always feel that things that one has done are always in the past, and really it's only, you know, what you're going to do this morning that you're going to be judged by. But I remember working with Lizzie as when I was working at the Freuds Museum in London, along with the Freuds Museum in Vienna, on a project. And I think that's where we got to know each other and to share our enthusiasm for print. Shall we show the PowerPoint, Jack?
Yes, I will. I'll just share that now.
Yeah. And if I ask you to press the buttons, is that all right?
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay, so if you go on to the next slide.
Yeah, sorry, Mike.
Yeah.
There we go. Right.
Okay, next slide. That's it. Yeah, this is a silkscreen print that I made before working with the Freuds Museum. But in a way, this one and the next slide, please. They both highlight my involvement with the idea of journey, and in a way of displacement. And you know, so these are images that were extensively developed within the computer and then printed, reconstituted as silkscreen prints, because I wanted the physical layering of the ink. If we could go on to the next one. Next slide. And also a project that I did before the Freuds Museum was at the Scott Polar Research Institute. And here's another example of the way that I use print. These were a whole series of postcards that I made and had printed. And then these postcards were sent to 7 ports of call of the ship, the Terra Nova, which was Scott's ship that he used to go to the South Pole. And I asked the postmaster postmasters at each port to put a stamp on the postcard, send it back to me, and have it franked. So in a way, these postcards carried the journey of, that I wasn't able to do myself. And I always think it's worth remembering that we are surrounded by print imagery. Our newspaper. Our newspaper is a limited edition. Postcards that we buy in tourist shops, souvenirs, and all the rest of it. So print, I see print as being really at the center of our culture. And incidentally, my late father, he was one of the leading experts in the country on print, on ink and paper. So as a child, I was brought up with printed stuff all around me, and I did all my drawings on the back of proofs. Go back to the next slide, please. So this exhibition I'm going to talk about briefly was first staged at the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, and then at the Freud Museum in London, and is going to be shown at the Beanie House of Knowledge in Canterbury in May. That's as long as everything is possible. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, this was the first collaboration between the museum in Vienna and London. And what I wanted to do was to highlight the fact that the museum in Vienna, where Freud had worked for 30 odd years and done all his work, was almost empty, while the museum in London, where he was only there for a year, was full of his artifacts and furniture and the couch and everything like that. Now, I focused the project largely on this coat, which you'll see hanging in the vestibule of the Freud Museum in London. And I had the idea that I wanted to have this coat x-rayed so that it could become something like the equivalent of the Turin shroud, a kind of cultural object. And I managed to persuade the National Gallery in London to agree to work with me and put aside one day when otherwise they would have been x-raying Titians or Rembrandts to work with me. Can we have the next slide, Jack? Part of the project was to employ a photographer, Peter Abrahams, who documented the whole performance of taking the coat from the museum to the National Gallery for it to be x-rayed and then back. And from these photographs, I made an artist book, which of course is another form of print. And this is one of the pages from that commercially produced book. Next page, next slide. Yeah, here's another page. And here you can see the way the coat began to sort of take on the character of a body. And it was quite interesting how we subconsciously started to think of the coat almost as like a corpse that had been laid out. Go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So these were all the x-rays of the coat, which were then digitally stitched together. And then the next slide. Oops, okay, that's been edited out. Anyway, I'm sorry about that. Next slide. I'm sorry, you can't see the, I must have done it as a TIFF instead of a JPEG. I must apologize. But the final print was a full-size digital X-ray of the coat, life-size. And I also made cabinets for the coat as if it was like a traveling relic. Next slide, please. Now, the other thing that I had the idea of doing was to send an image of Freuds Desk back to the museum in Vienna as a ghost. This is Freuds Desk in London, with all his what he called as old and grubby gods surrounding him. Next slide, please. So working with my assistant Holly, we 3D scanned every object on the desk. And so here's Holly on the left scanning them. And while she was doing that, I was drawing them to make up a kind of catalogue of all the objects. Next slide, please. And here you can see a 3D print of, which was 2/3 life size of all the objects on the desk, printed in white translucent nylon. Next slide, please. And these were shown, first of all, in Vienna, in the room where Freud's desk would have originally been, and then back in London. Next slide, please.
I was just going to
Yeah.
Put some points across. I love this. It's almost like a perfect exhibition for you, because I know you deal a lot with presence and absence. And
Yeah.
the idea of almost twin museums that have lost everything from there and filled there, and then you sort of almost bring it back the other way. And so you get this almost, you say, ghost of one museum within the other. It's really beautiful.
Exactly. Well, I mean, also the backdrop of this exhibition was what I felt was the insidious attack on refugees and asylum seekers. I wanted to somehow use the fact of Freud's migration as a reminder of how enriching migration has been to this country. So in a way, by taking one example, I hoped to hold it up as a mirror against some of the what I thought was horrible debate about migration. Yeah, ghosts are important, I guess. Can we have the next slide, please? And then from all these, data from the 3D scans, I then had images made which I could then play around and arrange, these resulted in this digital print, which in a way I kind of almost see as like a kind of chessboard laid out with all of Freud's objects. Next slide. And once again, a traveling cabinet was made for all these objects, and these were exhibited as part of the exhibition. So in a way, the exhibition was about absence, presence, travel, migration, and every bit of the exhibition was meant to endorse that idea. Could we go on next? And also the idea of what you would take with you in the case of an emergency. Now, these are all casts made in fiberglass, but in a way, casting has a very close connection to printmaking. You know, it is, and I use casting quite a lot in my sculpture, but I also use the things I make as starting points for other prints. So could we have the next slide? So here you can see a kind of ghost of these objects in the background of this laser cut woodcut that I made. And then onto the next slide. And here you can see, you know, once again, the objects have been rearranged and have formed the background for this photo etching that that's actually, I'm delighted, is now in the British Museum. So in a way, you can see just with the Freud exhibition. Sorry?
Sorry, there might be a slight lag, so I'll try and interrupt you once or twice. But I wanted to say it's a really interesting repetition you have here. So when we're looking at printmaking, because you've got you know, the casts themselves, the 3D printing, then the prints made of those sort of cast or 3D printed objects, that you're then using different techniques and also using digital techniques, which is I find really interesting, because printmaking has always been historically at the forefront of technology, and we're part of that. And I think that's what's really interesting now within your work, because there's a mix of new technologies being used, but then using sort of older techniques in terms of screen printing is a more of a handmade technique, and then it's sort of this layering of these processes. I think is really fascinating.
Well, that's a very interesting observation, Jack. And I think that, I mean, there's two things there. One is I think that often we make the mistake of thinking that technology is about new technology. But if you think of, say, for example, the development of the lead pencil over a piece of burnt wood, I mean, this was must have been transformative.
Yeah.
But what I like, the way I've always approached technology is that as technologies advance, you have a wider and richer toolkit, and you can use that for whatever means you feel is appropriate. I mean, so I never feel that I'm a particularly digital artist. I use whatever I can, and I use things in order to keep the ideas fresh. I suppose one of the things is that as an artist, you generally have one or two ideas, and you spend your life trying to clarify those and make an image which encapsulates that idea or those ideas better than you've done before. But you know, it's really sort of trying to say the same thing over and over again, but in better ways,
Yeah.
or more, you know. Shall I go on to the Soane Museum, because that was a kind of very different proposition. So this was a show that I had just before lockdown at the Sir John Soane Museum in London. And those of you that haven't visited this museum, it's absolutely amazing. It's a treasure trove. Can we have the next slide?
Yeah.
This gives you a kind of flavour of the richness in this museum, and it's full of architectural models. I mean, it was the place where Soane practiced as an architect, where he had apprentices, where he showed clients, and it's wonderful. It's an Aladdin's cave. Now, I wanted, taking on that idea that Jack articulated about absence and presence. I wanted to look at the museum from the perspective of the servants who would have been below stairs but would have been witness to all this wonderful stuff. And I imagined that they might want to have a bit of the action themselves, or try and do something themselves. So could we have the next slide? So I made a number of objects. This was originally made from pasta, sugar lumps, bourbon biscuits, and you can see a scrubbing brush on top. And these are, in a way, they're not ironic. I wanted them to be serious attempts of someone below stairs, of trying to come to terms with classical antiquity, with the stuff that they might have in the kitchen. They wouldn't have been sculptural materials, you know. Can we have another? Next slide.
Yeah.
And here's another one of those where there's shortcake biscuits form the lintel, and the main column is a cast of a leek. Can we have the next? And here you can see taking the ideas into 3D printing again. So these were objects that I made from vegetables, then had them 3D scanned and then printed and then reassembled. Another, next slide.
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh no, okay. Next slide. And then just to bring it to an end, these are 2 prints that are in the fair. So I hope you'll go and visit them. And these are laser cut woodcuts from constructions that I made using sugar lumps in my studio, where I tried to create images which could be thought of as old ruins. And in fact, these were inspired by, there's a wonderful album of Piranesi, Ruins of Rome, in the collection of the Somme. Next slide.
Yep.
And
is that coming up?
right, that's it. So these were kind of very playfully made, and you know, they go through these strange iterations. You know, so this begins with very, very quick sketchbook drawings in my notebooks, really just for my own pleasure and to explore an idea. Then buying tons of sugar lumps from the local supermarket and thinking, well, this is then my material. And I wanted them to be like sort of blocks of stone. And then hours of playing and taking photographs of different stages, and then selecting one in particular, then developing that on the computer in layers, trying to resolve it through this mess of pixelation. Then once the image seems to be coming into focus, the layers are then separated, and each layer is then used to make a digital laser cut wood block, which are then printed in turn, one on top of the other, through an etching press. And
is this three plate?
yeah, 3 blocks. Yeah.
And can I just ask, sorry, I might have preempted you, but the importance of choosing wood block over, say, screen printing, or?
Well, because I was rather sort of intrigued by, you know, the fact that a woodcut you generally associate with kind of expression, the expression of cutting, and I wanted to have a very detached feeling. You know, I wanted the cutting to be done mechanically. The other thing is that when you print with oil-based inks with woodcut, you build up a very rich and resonant surface, and so that's what I wanted. The other thing is that once the blocks were made, I could print them in different color combinations. So these prints exist in 2 or 3 different versions. So once, you know, and in fact, just as a nice little closing of the circle, these were printed in the studio of my old tutor at the Slade, Bartholomew dos Santos, in Portugal, where I've been going every year for a fortnight to actually print. And Barto dos Santos was really inspired by Piranesi, so the whole thing comes full circle.
That's really lovely. It's I find it, as I say, fascinating. I hadn't actually picked up on the servants part of that. You know, so that, again, the absence presence, which I think is a really nice and quite playful look at that. I also like what you're saying about how you're wanting to take yourself away from the actual process of physically making, but then you're also there in terms of sort of you've got full control. So you stepping back from that to create these, which is really nice.
Yeah, it's more that I want to kind of try and keep my gesture out of the equation, and also with once I had the wood blocks made, then I could do all the color experimenting in the studio. So these were extensively proofed before I came to combinations that seemed to work. Whereas if I'd worked with silkscreen, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
And the process of laser cutting, how does that work? So, I mean, I've never really sort of seen it in action.
Well,
it's quite...
Well, it's good. It's in a way I have them printed. I have them cut commercially, so I separate the layers out. Each layer is then made as a high contrast image, so it's either in or out. And then I, stipulate that I need the cutting to be fairly deep because I don't want any pickup from the bottom areas. The blocks are then cut for me and sent back in the post, and then it's up to me. So, and of course, also the order in which you print the blocks can dramatically change the image as well.
Can I just quickly also talk to you about so obviously you're using this printing process. Do you want to talk about the importance of printmaking as opposed to, say, painting? Here, I think it's a good point to talk about that.
Yeah, well, for me, I mean, I've been involved with printmaking since I very first went to art college in the 70s. And one of the things that I immediately found with printmaking was that it suited my personality because let me explain. If you're working in painting, you have the painting and you, the artist, and it's you and it, and nothing is going to change unless you make it change. And I found that sense of almost confrontation too difficult to handle. What I love about printmaking is that you make a certain number of decisions, and then you have to go through a process, and then you can then review what you've got and then move forward. So in other words, printmaking moves forward in stages, and it also involves a matrix. So, it's an etching plate, a silkscreen stencil, a lithostone, and each of these have characteristics which I find quite exciting. Does that seem to?
Yeah, that does. I completely understand that. When I'm painting, I always find there's almost sometimes there can be almost like a pressure that as you're building up, and then you're gonna you can have a day when you're really keen, really looking forward to painting, and everything you do just ruins, and you'll ruin maybe sort of weeks of what you had done.
Yeah.
And then with printmaking, there's always that freshness. You have that time to do it, and then almost sort of reevaluate, have a look, work out. And you can be then quite fresh with your mark making rather than overworking it, because you've got that time to always keep evaluating, which I've always felt for me took sort of the pressure off when I'm creating.
Well, also there's another aspect which for me is very important, and printmaking somehow prevents me from being too self-indulgent. I remember in the 1970s there were all these rock groups where there would be endless guitar solos that went on for about 10 or 15 minutes and boring as hell, but the guitarist would have his eyes closed and was in a state of sort of ecstasy. It was probably drug induced as well, probably. But I've always mistrusted the the idea of self-expression. In some ways, I want the idea to carry the message, and I want to be a little bit invisible. I don't want my hand to be immediately apparent. I mean, of course it is, because every decision is to do with one's hand, heart, and brain and eye. But I just want to prevent myself getting too indulgent and enjoying the mark making, because whenever I've done that in the past, it's always been a disaster. So I'm kind of for. I have to try and restrain myself and hold things back, and I would hope that a consequence of that is the images have a certain tension, that they're. But anyway, that's for the audience to think about.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I found that absolutely fascinating. I want to just quickly then sort of talk about some of your other parts of what you do. So you're an artist. You've exhibited with us for 4 years, but you're also for the last 2 years been a judge you've been part of a selection committee. And I just wanted to, and at the same time, you're also a professor at UAL, and I just wanted to talk about that relationship, given that you had talked about your relationship with your professor in terms of how you printed these works at his studio, and so how does that sort of the relationship of being a professor in art school reflect on your own artwork, or what you're looking
at? One of the things I realized at a very early age was that I felt that I had a very broad creativity, and I mean, I'm not someone that could go into my studio 7 days a week, close the door, and be happy. My working method is generally to mull over things, develop things in drawings and sketches and things like that, and then binge and make the work and things like this. But I'm not someone that works in my studio 9 to 5, 7 days a week. And I also realized that there were a lot of other things that I enjoyed doing that I didn't want to edit out of my life. I've always enjoyed writing. I've always loved teaching. I think teaching is a great privilege. I've, so in some ways, I hope that, when I'm 6 foot under, that I'm evaluated in terms of a broad spectrum of things, that have, kind of come together. And for me, it makes sense. Being professor, I think, carries quite a big responsibility, because I feel that I feel a responsibility to speak on behalf of the discipline of printmaking, and to be an advocate for printmaking, and to be as supportive as I can of a very wide range of practice. And so, in a way, when you kindly asked me to, be a judge for the print fair, I was delighted to accept. In that capacity, I don't see myself trying to represent my taste. I try and step out of that a little bit, and in a way, try and ensure that a very broad range of work which goes under the banner of printmaking is represented. And of course, also the other thing is, in the jury, I'm only one of a number of people selecting. So in a way, it's a broad consensus. I mean, that in that way, it's very different to, for example, when I curated the exhibition on Giorgio Morandi, where that was all my choices, and every piece of work was selected in order to fulfill a certain function within the exhibition. The print fair is something very different. It's a wonderful showcase and an opportunity for often young artists to get exposure and the opportunity of bringing their work to a wider public. And I'm delighted to do, in a very small way, support that.
Thank you. Well, it's I agree with everything you've just said there. The reason we try and pick a large I think we had eight selectors this year, just so that that it's as fair as possible, and everyone, everything gets evened out. Whatever anybody particularly looks for and is focusing on, or their tastes, or anything. And I think, like you were saying, that the importance is always to try and be try and take taste out of the equation and look at the sort of the idea behind the pieces, like how their techniques, how well worked out these ideas are on the plate.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe we could talk about some of the works, therefore, that you have seen at the fair that you particularly liked. I think we have a couple. I'm going to just quickly come off screen share. A couple of pieces that you did want to speak about that we are showing. I will load up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is a wonderful print by Chrissy Craig, who is a graduating student from Camberwell. So obviously, I've I have to declare my interest there. But I was very pleased that the other members of the jury also responded very warmly to this print. And this is from an original photograph of a disused swimming pool in a kind of garden, and I think it's incredibly evocative. It kind of talks about sort of decay and change, and also the relationship between man and nature. There's a sense here that nature is beginning to sort of take over what would have originally been some kind of pristine swimming pool, and is now becoming, something that is almost like, some mysterious bog. And
the idea of a swimming pool as well is really interesting, because almost, now I think about it, almost more than anything I can think of man-made. Swimming pools they're always very vibrant places, very busy. You think of holidays with people sunbathing all around them, kids jumping in and out of the swimming pool, or people doing lengths and practicing for an event. So the idea almost that they're when they become decayed and like this, it's sort of almost that contrast is made even more obvious.
That's right. And I think that that's endorsed by the way the photograph has been degraded, so that in a way information is lost and it becomes sort of more atmospheric. I think it's a very striking image.
Excellent. And we have oh yes.
Yeah. Now, I really like this little print by, well, it's not so little. I think it's about 40 centimeters, by James Randall. And I thought in a way it was quite a poignant comment on probably a lot of the feelings that we're having at the moment. Last week I did a big lecture, and I wasn't really sure if anyone was out there or not. And halfway through my talk, I had this kind of almost an anxiety attack that I'd actually gone mad and I was just talking to myself. And I think that this print is very evocative of an attempt at communication and how we picture communication and things like that. I think it's very simple, very direct. It's an etching and aquatinta. And even though this artist here is using technique which basically is 200 or 300 years old, he's used it to actually make a comment on the contemporary situation. And I think that's what's so exciting. As artists, we're forever looking forward and backwards for finding ways to articulate our ideas. I just think this is, it's almost like a visual poem without any words.
Yeah, it's got everything because it's as well as being, like you said, you've taken some quite deep meaning from it, and there's an element of it looking at climate change now and how things we aren't really, the world isn't listened to so much, and so those issues there. But it's also quite funny. I find the title itself, Cloud Conversation, and the sort of Beano-like references. Just I think I love it. I think I love the balance of the humour with the serious message behind it.
And for anybody out there with 250 quid, I mean, you have the opportunity to buy an image. It's a small edition of, I think, 25, and that money is going directly into supporting an artist's creativity. You could spend exactly the same amount of money on a poster of Monet, and that wouldn't be helping Monet or any artist anywhere.
No, so exactly, especially in this current climate when artists, visual artists, and artists starting out, or sort of early mid career artists, are having a really tough time. So you're right there. Okay, the right way.
Next one, I think it's James Seal.
This is James Seal. We've got another one as well.
Yeah. Could we have the other one?
Yeah, this piece. Sorry, this one or the other one? Sorry.
The next one. Yeah.
This one.
The one of the glass house.
Oh, sorry. Okay, right. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, this also has a bit of a kind of connection with Chris's print, but I think this is a very sophisticated image, and I think it says something about man and nature, about ecology, about some of the issues that we're going to have to deal with in order to preserve the planet. I mean, the sense of inside and outside, I think, is really beautifully done, and the sense that there's not that much difference between inside and outside. So, that is nature taking over, or is something else going on? But I think this is a beautifully resolved image, very and really quite sophisticated.
I think it's exquisite, and the colours in it as well are beautiful. Yeah. Glow coming out of the greenhouse itself. Whether there's this sort of beauty, but then also that sort of that orange, that yellow sort of almost is something almost unhealthy. You can't quite work out whether it's something that's a little bit sinister or sort of radiating and gorgeous.
Yeah, I mean, it has the quality of a faded photograph. And there's a kind of melancholy that comes with that as well.
No, I think it's really interesting because the process of photopolymer, which I think this is, really cleverly manipulated.
That's right. But I mean, these were just, you know, three things that sort of caught my eye. I mean, I do think that one of the things to think about works of art is that we derive an accumulative pleasure or knowledge from them. You can have a picture on your wall which you glance at every day over a period of 20 years. And if you top that up financially, it's minuscule what you're paying for the pleasure. And I think that also living with pictures helps you understand how you develop and change yourself. So, you know, sometimes an image that you started to live with takes on an added meaning as you get older, or an event happens in your life and things like that. You know, pictures are kind of mirrors into the way that we're thinking and feeling.
I think that's a really important point, actually, that I've never heard articulated so well. Because I think also, you know, like you were saying earlier, about how, the amount of imagery we have all the time, and they're sort of very quick, you know, instant satisfaction. You know, films and everything, we're always looking for something new, and everything's, you know, so everyone, and the idea of buying a picture that is a slow burner, that you look at, and as you progress through life, meanings change and develop, and you constantly look at and can pick out new things. And that's the really amazing thing about them. In an age that everything is so quick and almost cast away, this sort of 2D still imagery, how it has this ability to give joy constantly throughout a prolonged period of time.
Well, I agree. I mean, the other thing, you know, that about the visual arts, is the visual arts are the only art form in which time is not implicit in the experience of the work. And by that, I mean that if you were to listen to Beethoven's Ninth, you'd have to start at the beginning and get to the end before you could really say that you'd heard it. If you watched, you know, The Godfather, you'd have to start at the beginning and get to the end before you could say you could see it. But in fact, you can look at a picture for a second. And in fact, I think the average length of time in the National Gallery is about 8 seconds for looking at a picture. But if you're living with a picture, you accumulate that experience over time. So all those little seconds get added up. And a work of art that is enriching is one that will keep revealing things to you over time.
Yeah, I agree, and how it you know, in many ways can shape you, your choices progressing through. And obviously, there's, I think one of the reasons why people can be quite frightened about art is what it can also say about you, your choices, and you making these visual decisions, and how it then reflects back on you. And sorry, you were about to say something?
Yes, I mean, it's that most of us lack confidence, you know, so that, you know, if you have something on your wall that you know, I mean, let's say, for example, you have a print of an Andy Warhol, then in a way, you know, Andy Warhol is already, you know, accepted as being a great and things like this. So it's no great risk on your behalf to have that on your wall. On the other hand, if you have a piece of work by someone unknown, or not in the, you know, known in the by the general public, then it's much more. It reflects much more on you that you've made that choice.
Yeah,
because in a way you are saying that you think this is good or exciting, as opposed to you saying, well, the world thinks this is good and therefore I agree with it.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it's important, and I do hope people do appreciate that and need to you know, be brave and be confident in your choices. You know, everything at our fair, for instance, you know, has gone through a selection committee. We all think that everything there is good, and it's just you deciding, you know, what you like as an individual, and how you and what you want to live with. Well, look, Paul, I think that's a really nice nice point to end. Lauren, I think you are on the line. I can't see any questions that we may have had. Is there any questions that maybe you could read out for Paul or myself? Okay, well, I'm afraid I don't think I can get through to Lauren.
Sorry, Jack. I don't think we have any questions. I can't see any.
Okay.
If somebody else has any that they'd like to ask.
Well, in which case, if there isn't, I'll wait a few more minutes. Well, I'll just thank you, Paul. I really enjoyed that discussion. I think that was really fascinating. And like I said, a few things that I never really heard articulated so well. And it's really nice and thought-provoking, that, especially that final part on you know, the way that we live and how art you know, can develop us or develop as we live with it, and the experiences that we have and how that reflects. So I think it was really interesting. So thank you very much.
well, thank you, Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, well, good luck with everything. If COVID does allow, I'll definitely be at I'll definitely turn up to the exhibition. Is it
in May in Canterbury?
May, down in Canterbury. I think that'd be really interesting. I mean, quite a long way from Durham, but I'll definitely make it. It'll be like a pilgrimage.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you very much.
Take care. Good luck to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.